Hi, everyone. This is Jason Birak of Wall Street from Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street from Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest. He is chairman of the Institute for Political Economy. He was the Assistant Treasury Secretary under President Reagan. He is also an associate editor at the Wall Street Journal. And he has a long list of bio and accomplishments throughout academia and journalism and also in the private sector. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts.
Pleased to be with you, Jason.
Now, Paul, in terms of the U.S. foreign policy, you're in the U.S. government, you're in the Treasury Department under Reagan, fighting the Cold War with the Soviets. Would you say that the U.S.'s foreign policy has just gotten more and more radical the last decade or two since 9/11 and the Patriot Act?
Yes, of course, Jason. It's gotten radical since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. That released the neoconservatives who used the Soviet collapse to claim that history had chosen the United States to exercise hegemony over the world. Now, the Soviet collapse had proved that there was no alternative to the American system, and therefore the United States had the right and the responsibility to impose its system on the world. And this is what gave rise to the drive for hegemony that is often referred to today as the American empire. And so, yes, it's far more radical than in the days prior to the Soviet collapse. When the Soviet Union was there, it was seen as an alternative system of equal power and success, and that's why we had this Cold War. So it wasn't so much 9/11 as it was the Soviet collapse. 9/11 was simply an excuse to begin the wars of conquest in the Middle East, all of which have failed.
Now, I remember reading the Francis Fukuyama book talking about American hegemony and things like that, but it just seems like the United States' desires to grow the welfare and warfare state, it did start to rapidly accelerate. It was already big before the Soviet Union collapsed, but it just seemed to accelerate after that because the U.S. basically filled the power vacuum with the only large empire left, and there was no one to really put it into check at this point. But it seems the U.S. may have grown to the point now where I don't know if the welfare warfare state can continue to grow because of all the amount of money just to sustain it, like the past empires of Britain and Rome, where you have the desire for expansion. If you go back through history and look at those. And in the U.S., the debt levels and the amount of money in dollars just to keep, the status quo going, it just doesn't seem sustainable to me.
Well, the United States is overextended, both economically and in terms of its foreign aggressions. But the United States foreign policy is driven by what is known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine. Paul Wolfowitz is one of the main neoconservatives, and as a high Pentagon official, he drafted the Wolfowitz Doctrine, which says that the United States has as its principal goal to prevent the rise of any other power. And the Wolfowitz Doctrine explicitly spells out Russia and says that the United States' primary goal is to prevent the rise of Russia to any any position in which it could serve as a check on American purposes in the world, and therefore any sign of Russian revival has to be met with a concerted effort by the United States to break up the Russian Federation. So that then is the reason for the trouble we started in Ukraine, and it's the reason for putting all of these new bases and troops and missiles on Russia's border. and for trying to convince the European members of NATO to accept Georgia and Ukraine as NATO members. So the Wolfowitz Doctrine essentially commits the United States to war with Russia and with China, because it is another rapidly rising power about which the United States seems unable to do anything, except to construct new naval and air bases from the Philippines to Vietnam. So this doctrine of the neoconservatives, which does determine American foreign policy, it's unique in the sense that there are no other forces influencing American foreign policy. It commits the country to wars with two nuclear powers. And so the future of humanity is greatly threatened by this Wolfowitz Doctrine.
It's great points, Paul. And in terms of the military-industrial complex, you know, we had the exit speech from Dwight Eisenhower, and he warned us about this. And obviously, if he was still probably president for a number of years before that, he probably wouldn't have given that speech. But since he was leaving the presidency, he felt like, you know, I'm not going to be part of the political machine anymore, really. I can say this on my way out the door, that this is one of the greatest dangers to our country, is the growth of the military-industrial complex. All these you know, people relying on selling guns and bombs and bullets and things like that during times of peace, looking for new ways to create war. But in your experiences in the government, Paul, the evidence has come out with declassified government documents and documentaries. There was a documentary called Houston, We Have a Problem, and it talked about how after the oil crisis of the 70s, how the U.S. basically baited Reagan and other people in the government, baited the Soviet Union into taking on too much debt with the higher oil prices, and then intentionally crashed the oil price down to help bankrupt the Soviet Union. And then that's what potentially led to the Soviet Union going bankrupt about 10 years later, was too much debt and then the oil price dropping. Do you think that there's an attempt to do that now in the oil markets, to maybe send Putin a message that, you know, the U.S. is still the main big boy in power economically and militarily and things like that?
The United States will do everything it possibly can to cause problems for Russia and for China. The difference is that today the Russians and the Chinese are exiting the dollar payment system and creating different mechanisms for settling trade between countries. And if they succeed in this, or if they move rapidly enough along, this will insulate them from the kinds of financial manipulations for which the United States is famous. So I don't know that this effort will be very successful. I have something to say about the Eisenhower speech. I think what Eisenhower was concerned about was the corruption of democratic representation in the United States by the campaign contributions and influence, job-wise, in the various congressional districts, such that the members of Congress, of the House and Senate, would cease to be responsible to the people who elected them and would be responsible to the military security complex that was providing the campaign contributions and that had sort of locked up various congressional districts with defense industry spending. So I don't think Eisenhower understood the full impact, which has come only with the Wolfowitz Doctrine, because this then takes it beyond the United States into the international realm, where the world can be at war because of this doctrine of American hegemony. So I think that is one difference. Now, on the Soviet collapse, the manipulation of oil prices and so on, if that story is actually true, it probably did hurt the Soviet Union. But the main problem the Soviets suffered from was they had no rational signals on which to allocate investment, no rational signals on which to allocate resources. And so they really couldn't tell whether their output was more or less valuable than the inputs. And the fact of the matter is that in most cases, the inputs were more valuable than the output. And so it was a system that did not produce growth, but which wasted its resources. And that's the reason the system that the system collapsed. Reagan did not have any goal of collapsing the Soviet Union. He did not have any goal of winning the Cold War. He only wanted to end it. And the Reagan administration had no idea that one consequence of ending the Cold War would be the Soviet collapse. He just wanted to stop the danger of nuclear war by removing the Cold War as a possible cause.
Okay, and in terms of the Soviet Union, yeah, you mentioned the price signals, but another thing, I read Jim Rogers' book, Adventure Capitalists, or actually Investment Bikers, where he rode through the Soviet Union. He was granted permission to drive his motorcycle through the Soviet Union, and he was talking about, all the people who weren't working that hard, and then when Germany reunified East Germany after the Berlin Wall fell, it said that it took 4 workers, East Germans, to do the work of 1 West German. So, I mean, the entrepreneurial spirit, the small businessman, the hard worker that's required, of a mostly capitalist or free enterprise type economy, it just wasn't there in the country. And that's probably part of the allocation of capital part that you're speaking of. There just wasn't the desire to go the extra mile to delay gratification and do all those other things. And it just what the work ethic for the majority of citizens wasn't there to put in the extra mile because people, there wasn't the economic incentives of profits and getting rich and things like that. Well, maybe the party members at the top of the Soviet Union were doing that, but, the majority of people, the incentive structure wasn't there, and I think that's why communism and socialism ultimately fell in the long run is because of, improper incentives.
Well, the incentives had to do with managerial success. And managers could be successful even though their output was not useful to consumers. And the reason for that is the manager's success was defined in terms of gross output indicators. So many pounds, so many cubic feet, so many square feet, so many, just a number of things.
Sounds like the aggregates we use now, Paul. Sounds like a lot of them now that the Bureau of Labor Statistics comes up with, and the Department of Labor, and all the other economic calculations and new formulas for GDP and all the other things like hedonics and geometric weighting that are released in the statistics right now in the U.S. even.
Well, the U.S. statistics are actually a different problem because they're manipulated for a variety of reasons. And therefore, they don't give you a true economic picture, but they don't actually affect the fact that that still a profit is an indicator of manager success, and that still, to some extent, profits are due to the manager using resources successfully to produce products that satisfy consumer wants. Now, when profits are produced by offshoring the jobs, this hurts the consumer economy domestically because the people lose the jobs, they lose the income, the market shrinks. When high share prices reflect simply companies borrowing money from banks to buy back their own shares, then this is a false signal that the corporations are being successful. But basically, it's still prices and profits that organize the system. Of course, it can be manipulated greatly by policymakers, but still prices and profits. And in the Soviet Union, prices and profits did not have a role. And therefore, the people could work very hard to produce the output of the factory that would make the manager successful, but the output might not be useful to the people who worked hard to produce it. And therefore, in that sense, there was very little consumer satisfaction. For example, at one time, every lampshade produced in the Soviet Union was exactly the same size and the same color. There was no variety, no shoes. They always had a huge supply of baby shoes and none for people with large feet. And the reason was the success indicator was in terms of the number of pairs of shoes. Well, if you've got a limited amount of leather and materials, the smaller the shoe, the more number of pairs you're going to get out of the material. The same thing was true throughout the structure of industry, like nails. I remember when I was at the University of Moscow in the 60s, there was a cartoon on the bulletin board at the university, and the manager of the Soviet factory was being awarded, the Soviet nail factory, he's being awarded the medal, hero of the Soviet Union. There were two giant cranes holding up one giant nail because he had overproduced his quota, which was in terms of tons of nails. So he had one huge nail. So this sort of thing meant no matter how hard people worked, there was nothing that came to them in terms of usable products or products that provided any real satisfaction. Do you see what I'm saying?
Consumers are the most important, like von Mises talks about, consumers are the most important things in society for the economy because they vote with their dollars and they vote which companies they like and don't like, and those are the ones that stay in business, and that's the market signal that the producer should either increase production, and then it's trial and error. Then if they put out a product and consumers don't buy it, they either have to change the product or packaging or things like that. Yeah.
So trying to run a complicated system without prices and profits as the main indicators means that the system simply doesn't function. And that's really what did the Soviet economy in.
Now, in terms of the real economy here in the United States, what's your opinion of the real economy? Is there inflation in food, energy, rent, utilities, cable bills, things like that, or is it really the deflation that these Keynesians on the mainstream media and academia talk about?
No, there's a considerable amount of inflation. It's not measured because the way they measure inflation has been changed over the decades not to find any because they don't want to pay the cost of living adjustments to Social Security. So they've done two things over the decades. During the Clinton administration, they had the Boskin Commission, and what the Boskin Commission did is they destroyed the consumer price index as a measure of a constant standard of living. They said, look, when prices go up, consumers substitute cheaper items. And so what we are going to do with the consumer price index, if the price of, say, New York strip steak goes up, we're just going to throw it out and stick in a cheaper thing like round steak. So this substitution effect simply turns the consumer price index into a measure of a falling standard of living.
Yeah, it's not constant standard of living.
And so if you can throw out the things that the prices go up on and substitute things that they don't or that they go up by a lesser amount, this then holds down the measured rate of inflation. Now, the other thing they did, Jason, they started redefining price rises as quality improvements. Now, this makes a certain amount of sense that there are some reasons that price goes up. It's not inflation. It's just they've improved the thing. They've put more into it and so on. However, over time, there were more and more and more and more and more of these items, so that you reach the point that just about any kind of price increase gets called a quality improvement, and so they don't count it.
Yeah, it's getting ridiculous, like with the iPad getting 10% lighter, and that justifies the hedonic adjustment.
Yeah, they call them hedonic adjustments. And so the inflation measures now no longer coincide with the actual amount of inflation. John Williams, who runs the site shadowstats.com, he is a very distinguished statistician, an expert on the government data. He measures the inflation according to the official methodology in 1990 and the official methodology in 1980. And according to the official methodology of 1990, the current rate of inflation is 5%. According to the official methodology of 1980, my day in the Treasury, the official inflation rate, according to that methodology, is between 9 and 10% annually. So you can see either it's 5 to 10 times the official inflation announcements that they give us. And anyone who visits the grocery store on a regular basis knows that there are substantial price increases in food. Indeed, anything you buy, you can see there are substantial price increases, including services. So the inflation measure no longer tells us anything. It's mainly used for reassurance. Oh, there's no inflation. There's no inflation. And, of course, it prevents having to pay out Social Security cost of living adjustments. Now, as for the economy, the American economy, there really isn't one. It was offshored. The industrial manufacturing jobs were ladders of upward mobility that gave America the reputation of being an opportunity society. These jobs, for the sake of profits and managerial bonuses, were moved offshore. And then with the rise in the high-speed internet, they began moving offshore the middle-class professional, tradable professional services such as software engineering, research, design that college graduates used to take. And so that you now find college graduates working as waiters and bartenders and living at home with their parents, because the kinds of employment that they were accustomed to finding for their careers, these have also been moved offshore. So what the United States economy has been doing since the Soviet collapse, because it was the Soviet collapse that caused China and India to open their large, underutilized labor forces to Western capital. Since 1991, you've watched the Americans simply move offshore the middle-class jobs.
Yeah, and
so there's no economy here. In 2004, I was speaking at a Brookings Institution conference in Washington about this problem. And when I was asked the consequence, I said that in 20 years, the United States would be a third world country. Well, it's been 10 years, and we now have almost every indication of third world country. The only jobs that are ever created are lowly paid domestic service jobs.
Yeah, and the middle class seems to be destroyed because they're not adapting to how the economy is changing. The economy itself is not being allowed to adapt as much. There's just too many rules, regulations, taxes, permits, fees, other stuff that go in to the point where a lot of U.S. corporations are not even making a lot of research and development investments here in the U.S. in jobs. They're buying back their own stock, or they're doing inversions and moving their corporate headquarters,
Jason,
to other different
I don't think it has anything to do with regulations. It has to do with moving the jobs offshore so that the American people no longer are paid middle-class wages or salaries. In fact, they have a hard time even finding full-time employment. Increasingly, the jobs are part-time, no benefits. No one can live on this type of job, much less is there any discretionary consumer purchasing ability to drive a consumer-driven economy. So what's happened by moving all the jobs offshore is that the collapse of American consumer demand. There's been no growth in real consumer incomes, real median family incomes in years. In fact, they're declining. So there's no growth in real retail sales. There's no growth in real consumer credit because the banks are busted and won't lend, and the consumers are up to their eyeballs in debt. Once the offshoring hit the economy, Alan Greenspan at the Federal Reserve tried to compensate for the absence of growth in real consumer income with a credit expansion. He substituted a buildup in consumer debt for the missing purchasing power that was associated with the rise in real incomes from the increased productivity in manufacturing and industry and from the increased productivity and in professional service jobs from the electronics and so forth. So once the consumer had expanded, had used up the amount of debt they could take on, there was nothing else to drive the economy. And it hasn't gone anywhere since the collapse in 2007. There's not been a recovery. The recovery they create by using they create an image of recovery by using the measure of inflation that doesn't measure inflation to deflate the nominal gross domestic product. Well, if you've got 4% nominal GDP growth and your inflation measure is 1%, then you can say, oh, look, we've got 3% growth. But if the real inflation is 5%, like John Williams says, then you've got minus 1% GDP growth. And that's basically what we've been having these years. And so they can create the image of, it's not a very strong growth, but they can create an image of a recovery from the 2007 recession. They can create the image of a growing economy simply by underestimating inflation. So this is the sort of situation we face. It doesn't matter what the regulations are. If you move the high value added, high productivity jobs offshore in order to boost shareholders' return and managerial bonuses. And so in order to maximize profits for the executives and the shareholders, they've destroyed the American economy. That's basically what they've done.
Okay, and well, what I was going to say with the regulation argument was that if the regulations and rules and taxes were lower, there would be more incentive for people to actually make investments into the U.S. to bring factory jobs back, to allocate capital into industries maybe where capital had not been allocated in a while, and start improving efficiencies. I think you may start to see that, but it will be mostly from technology gains from Silicon Valley with software gains and things like that. You're starting to see Silicon Valley start attacking other more established industries that have been around, for a lot longer than normal technology industries. But it's not going to create a mass amount of jobs. And like you pointed out in the interview, there's many millions of Americans out there who want a full-time job who can't find one.
Yeah, whatever Silicon Valley comes up with, it'll just the work will go offshore because the difference in labor cost is huge. And of course, when the work goes offshore, the GDP does too. I mean, where do you think China got its unprecedented rates of growth? No country in history has ever grown at the rate of China. And it's largely due to the movement of U.S. economy to China. And as long as you see these labor cost differentials, nobody is going to start any businesses here. There's no sign of middle class jobs being created. If you go through the monthly payroll job statistic reports, as I do every month, I usually publish a column about it. You see, where do we create jobs? Waiters, bartenders, hospital orderlies, retail clerks.
And then you look at all
the
the
third
stores.
world workforce.
Yeah, and then you look at that humongous amount of restaurants, casual dining restaurants are closing, retail stores are closing. You talked in other interviews I've listened to about Family Dollar and Family General stores are closing. And then you hear executives from Walmart talk about how the middle class consumer doesn't have discretionary spending. These are all confirming what you said and not what the mainstream media says, that the consumer is not recovering, that the economy is not really recovering, because you need full-time jobs, you need discretionary spending in order to have any kind of a recovery, so people can invest and save and things like that.
That's right, Jason. You see, it benefits the individual firm, its shareholders, and the executives to move their production offshore. But the aggregate effect of firms doing this is to destroy the domestic consumer market. And the inability to have a consumer market in economies that are driven by consumer demand leaves you with no economy. And that's what we've got. And that's why I say there's no economy here. It's 10 years since I made my prediction, and I think we'll actually be a third world economy before the 20 years. If you looked around today, what are the firms doing? They're borrowing money from banks to buy back their shares. Why? Because the rise in the share price is an indication of managerial success, so they can then pay themselves these huge multi-million-dollar bonuses. You see, everybody has forgotten, perhaps, that some years ago, Congress passed a law that executives could not be paid more than $1 million a year and still have it deducted as a business expense, as a cost to the business, unless it was performance related. And that means that the profits go up. So how have they gotten all these multi-million-dollar bonuses? They offshored the workforce, dropping the labor cost, up goes their profits and therefore their bonuses, and they buy back their stock. And another way they do it, they don't maintain the capital position of the company. You take these telephone companies, these jillions of telephone companies since the breakup of AT&T. There's no bigger market for them. What do? They don't do maintenance. They don't they don't update. And so when you have a trouble, it takes a week to get your phone fixed. And it used to take AT&T 2 hours at no charge. So when you have a system in which it's only interested in short-term profits for the people running it, it's going to fail.
Yeah, I agree. It's rent-seeking from the large corporations. It's rent-seeking from Wall Street. It's rent-seeking from the politicians in D.C. who want to just, maintain their political power and stay elected and or move up in offices at all time. And the problem with the economy, as you said so succinctly, is rent-seeking.
That's certainly one of the problems, and they can certainly rent-seek by offshoring jobs and buying back their stock and refusing to provide good service to customers.
Now, in terms of the sustainability of the system with the growth in the U.S. welfare warfare state, how the consumer is not doing well, is this sustainable for another decade or two before, people wake up and say, we can't take this anymore and start voting all the politicians out? How much longer do you think the current status quo can stay in place?
Well, it depends on how much longer the dollar is the world reserve currency, because that's the reason the United States can sustain a ridiculous, irrational system that it has, because it can pay its bills by printing money. And it can do that only because the dollar is the world reserve currency. But because the United States abuses this role, and because it uses this role to punish other countries like sanctions, then what you see happening in the world is they are exiting the dollar payment system, and that means a collapse in the dollar as world reserve currency. Now, how rapidly will they exit this system? Well, we see the BRICS, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, Russia. They are creating a new payment system that uses their own currencies, that doesn't use dollars. They're creating a new World Bank, IMF type bank to cover any sort of shortfalls in balance of payments capability of payments. And we now see where the Russians are talking about simply creating a different clearing system than the SWIFT system that the United States dominates, because people are tired of being bullied, threatened, sanctioned. And so the United States, with its aggressive foreign policy, is actually driving people away from the use of the dollar. And therefore, that makes it much harder for the dollar to prevail, because if you don't use the dollar to settle international accounts, the demand for dollars collapses. So how can you keep the exchange value up? It becomes more and more difficult. For now, they can do it. They can force the Japanese to print yen to buy dollars. They can force the European Central Bank to print euros to buy dollars. Or they can simply force them into currency swaps. Here's $100 billion, give us the equivalent euros. Here's $100 billion, give us the equivalent yen. And then the Fed can use the money from the currency swap to keep the dollar propped up. Everything is totally manipulated. But the ability to continue this manipulation declines with time as people move away from the dollar, and the Japanese realize, we keep giving them our valuable money for their unvaluable money, and this support of their currency isn't going to last much longer. Why are we doing it? The Europeans may come to the same conclusion. So how long it can go on? It's gone on longer than I thought possible, but I didn't realize the full extent of the corruption and the manipulation. There's no such thing any longer in the United States as a free market. The gold market's rigged. The stock market's rigged. The bond market's rigged. The currency markets are rigged. How long can they keep them rigged? That's the question that you're asking.
Yeah, how long are the foreign creditors, like you mentioned, are they going to be willing to swallow the inflation from currency wars and dollar pegs that the U.S. is basically able to export to them? How long are they willing to eat that and prop up the U.S. dollar, the U.S. bond market, the U.S. consumer, so the U.S. consumer can overconsume with that? The U.S. consumer has been, overconsuming for a very long time, considering they didn't have real income growth and the savings to justify further consumption. And, it's just a question of when people are going to get fully fed up with the system. I mean, people here in the U.S. who don't have a full-time job and are not at the age where normally in the past they would have, savings and a family and things like that. My generation, Generation X and Generation Y, the millennials, it's just a question of when all these different groups of foreigners and Americans are going to wake up and, say we won't take the system anymore. So I think people, thanks to your interviews, Paul, you're starting to wake people up. and hopefully I'm doing some of that too with our interviews. I just want to thank you again for your time, Paul. It's been almost 40 minutes. Been very gracious with your time, and you've given us some great answers, and hopefully we can have you on again soon. Can you please tell our listeners where they can find your articles that you say you publish frequently?
Well, my website is www.paulcraigroberts.org, and that's where they first appear, and they go from there all over the place, and in fact, more places than I know of. But they can find them there on that site, and I appreciate your efforts, Jason, and be pleased to come back on your program again sometime.
Yeah, great. And I really enjoy the joint articles that you publish with my friend Dave Kranzler. Those are pretty insightful into the precious metals markets. We didn't have a chance to talk about the precious metal markets, but we'll talk about them on the next interview.
Well, they're rigged. That's all you need to know.
Well, it's probably easier. It's probably harder to come up with something that's not rigged now, Paul. So.
Yeah. Right.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Okay, Jason. Appreciated the conversation. Goodbye.